Hey guys, my name is Trevor Sullivan and welcome back to my video channel. Thank you so much for joining me for yet another video in our Rust programming tutorial series. Now, in most of the past videos that we've been covering so far, we've covered a lot of topics surrounding the code itself in Rust. So how do we declare variables? How do we declare custom data structures? How do we declare enumerations? How do we implement traits and things of that nature? Now, we're going to be shifting topics a little bit here. It's still going to be Rust centered, but rather than talking so much about the code in Rust, we're actually going to be talking about how to document our code so that anybody who's using your application or a library that you wrote for Rust is going to be able to look at the documentation for your project and be able to figure out how to integrate your custom library into their own application or use your command line tool if you're publishing a binary project as opposed to a library. So there's a really cool utility that's included as part of the Rust toolchain, and this is known as Rustdoc. So you can actually just run Rustdoc at the command line once you've got the Rust toolchain installed. And this is the utility that's going to help to generate your documentation from your actual source code. Now, you can also run Rustdoc through the Cargo CLI tool, and this is generally more preferable than calling Rustdoc directly, because when you use the cargo doc command, you can actually have some of the parameters passed automatically for you so that you don't have to type out the entire Rustdoc CLI command with all of the arguments to point Rustdoc to your specific project. So as long as you've got your cargo project initialized, you've got your cargo.toml file, you can just do a cargo doc command, and that'll automatically kind of figure out where your project is, and it'll spit out your documentation into your target folder, which is typically where the binaries that are compiled for your application in debug or release mode are generated as well. So instead of a debug or release folder, it'll plug your documentation files into that doc folder. Now, the nice thing about using Rustdoc is that this generates the same documentation that you see on websites like doc.rs. So if we go over to doc.rs right here and we look for a library such as Serde, for example, which I did a video on recently talking about how to serialize and deserialize JSON data from Rust, you'll see that we have this crate level documentation. This kind of introduces the purpose of this particular library. And then as you kind of go down further, there's a separate section that talks about the child modules that are exported by this crate. So you can have a crate, you can break it down into child modules, and then each of those child modules within your crate can also define things like functions and traits and data types or data structures using the struct keyword. So as you kind of drill down here, you'll see we have structs, enums, traits in these different modules. And this format of this documentation is actually the exact same thing that you see when you use Rustdoc to generate documentation locally on your development workstation. So when you run the cargo doc command and ultimately invoke the Rustdoc CLI, it basically spits out some static HTML that's structured very similar to what you see right here on docs.rs, and that'll give you a nice preview of what other people are going to see when they seek out the official documentation for your project. Now, the other cool thing to note about docs.rs here is that this is the official documentation site for crates that are published to the official Rust registry. I almost said container registry. I was thinking more of Docker Hub, but we're talking about the Rust crate registry at crates.io. So if you head out to crates.io right here and you look for something like Serde or maybe, rocket.rs or something like that, then when you check out the documentation over here, you'll often see a link to the docs.rs page for that particular project. Let me check out Serde here to see if that's where there's links to. Yeah, sure enough, Serde does actually link directly out to docs.rs. I guess Rocket just chose to self-host their own documentation and use that as the primary source, but oftentimes, most of the time, I would even argue that you're going to see a link to docs.rs, and that'll be kind of the authoritative location for the documentation for various Rust crates that you come across. Also, another library that I did a video on was the clap library here. So if we go over there, once again, you can see that if you want the documentation for the clap library to parse command line arguments, that's going to take you directly over to docs.rs. Now, one of the things I really like about using docs.rs is that it shows you the historical versions right here. So it actually looks at all the metadata for your cargo.toml file, and it displays all of the different historical versions. So if somebody is running a specific version of your library and they need to look at documentation for that specific version, they can actually just find that version list right in here. Plus, there are external links back from docs.rs to crates.io, the original source code for this project. So if it's hosted over on GitHub, it'll take you straight over to GitHub, as in the case of clap right here. And so it's just a really nice experience. You can also do searches here, and this search feature is included when you render the static HTML documents locally as well. So you don't have to implement that yourself. It's just an automatic out-of-the-box feature provided by Rustdoc itself. There's keyboard shortcuts, so you can do just, shift question mark or shift forward slash to do a question mark, and that'll show the keyboard help here. Also, if you're scrolling somewhere in the docs and you want to do a search, you can just hit S on your keyboard, and that'll jump you up to the search bar here. And so having this standardized format for everything Rust related is really nice, so that you don't have to go out and seek out different types of tool chains, like maybe Docusaurus, which is a static site generator that I actually use for one of my websites, docs.opensrc.dev. And so rather than having to have all of these disparate systems for documentation, everything in Rust is kind of unified in this Rustdoc toolchain. So we're going to be taking a look at how you can actually write your own documentation in your Rust crates that uses this exact same structure so that you have consistency with the look and feel of the documentation for your project. Now, I would encourage you to, as you're working with Rust documents or comment-based documentation in your source code files, I would encourage you to check out the reference here for Rustdoc. So if you just go out to your favorite search engine and just search for the Rustdoc book right here, this is one of the core kind of books that's provided by the Rust project, and it just helps you to understand all the different features that are available in Rustdoc. For example, you can just use Markdown right inside of your documentation. So if we take a look at how to write docs, it's going to show us, how do you use different types of comments here at the crate level, at the individual function level, at the struct or enum level, individual enum variants, individual fields on structs can also be documented as well. So there's special syntaxes that you're going to need to memorize. Trust me, there's not too much that you have to memorize, just a few key things. And again, I always encourage people to spend hands-on time with these utilities so that when it comes time to actually write your documentation, you're not fiddling too much with the tooling, but you're able to efficiently write the documentation and then get back to enhancing your module or your crate with new features, bug fixes, and so on and so forth. So we're going to be taking a look at how to kind of do crate level documentation and do documentation at things like the module level, things at the function level, at the enum level, the struct level, all that stuff. There's also a doc attribute here that allows you to embed external markdown files if you want to. So technically when you do a triple slash, it's actually expanding to this doc attribute here, but it actually allows you to include separate markdown files. So if you don't want to use help documentation directly inside of your source code, you can actually use this include string macro to point to external markdown files that you can then basically bring in at document generation time. And that helps to keep your source code a little bit more clean, but you can still document things in these external markdown files. There's also the ability to create links between different types and functions within your library. You can also write inline tests. So you can basically create a block of code as part of your module. And just using these triple backticks right here, you can say, all right, this block of code is actually going to test out this particular function or type. And then it'll actually allow you to run cargo test commands to parse those code samples and then execute them so that you can make sure that your code is actually working the way that you expect. So being able to embed your tests inside of comments is super cool as well. There's also some other advanced features, but we're just going to cover some of the primary features of Rustdoc. So without further ado, let's go ahead and spin up a Scratch project. We're not going to do any smoke and mirrors here. I don't have anything pre-prepared. code. I have practiced it personally, but I'm not going to just kind of throw you a project that doesn't really make sense to you as far as the structure and then try to kind of explain it to you. We're actually going to do everything completely from scratch so that if you're building a Rust library or binary application from the ground up, you'll be able to follow the same kind of series of steps, right? So before we actually jump into the code, I just wanted to encourage you to subscribe to my channel. I am an independent content creator, so any kind of support that you lend to this channel helps me to bring you content like this video, as well as the past videos in the Rust series. So make sure that you subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon so that you get notified in the YouTube application about any new videos that are published. Also, I have this playlist featured right down here on my channel that covers the Rust programming language. We're up to 27 published videos so far, so this will be the 28th video. And if there's any topics in here that you aren't familiar with, feel free to just kind of go through the list of videos in this playlist and feel free to just jump into any of those topics. If you want to learn about threading, we've got videos on that. If you want to learn about mutexes and sharing data between threads, feel free to check out that video. If you want to send messages between threads with channels, then feel free to check out that video. We've got JSON parsing, file system APIs, CLI argument parsing, and a whole bunch of other stuff in here. And there's a lot more to come as well, because Rust is a huge popular language and it's growing on a regular basis. Also, please leave a comment down below and let me know what you thought of this video, and leave a like on the video if you learned at least one thing new by the end of the video, or if you just enjoyed watching this video for whatever reason. Also, I'm going to leave some links down in the pinned comment down below, so if you want to provide some support to this channel, you can click those links and make a purchase, and then that'll help to support this channel as well. So I really appreciate all of the support that you guys have provided so far, and my objective is really to continue bringing you great content on Rust and other technical topics. All right, so let's go ahead and spin up a new project. And because we're going to be dealing with a local web browser, I'm not going to be using my remote Linux system for development. I've actually got the Rust toolchain installed on my local Windows system here. And so because I need to be able to open my HTML files locally after I generate them with Rustdoc, we're just going to be using my Windows system for the time being, just to keep things simple. Also, I do have a Linux virtual machine here running Ubuntu Studio. So sometimes I actually do use this system to do graphical work, but the remote desktop protocol is a little bit slow. And so sometimes I don't necessarily prefer to use this environment just to keep things high performance and fluid and everything. But if I need to, I will jump into my desktop Linux system that's running as a local Hyper-V virtual machine. All right, so on my Windows system right here, I just have a Git directory at the root of my drive where I typically create all of my projects. And we're just going to go ahead and create a new directory for us to work inside of. And so I'll just do make_dir rustdoc_learning right here. And then we'll go ahead and open that up inside of VS Code right here. So we'll just do code at the CLI and then specify the path to that directory. And that'll open up a new window. So as you can see, this is an empty directory. There's nothing in there. So we're just going to do a cargo init command. Whoops, let me do cargo init. And I don't know why I accidentally hit that. So what we're going to do now is go ahead and customize our main.rs file here by adding some documentation. Before we actually add that documentation, though, I just want to show you what version I'm on. So I'm on Rust compiler version 1.72.1. That was just released about a week ago. I think today is the 20th of September. So yeah, 1.72.1 is pretty new. And so that's the version I'm running. And then I'm also running Cargo version 1.72.1 as well. Of course, those should match generally, but I guess maybe in some cases you might not have matching versions. I'm not sure. But what we're going to do now is use the cargo doc command here. So there's actually two different commands. There's cargo doc, and then there's cargo doc test. So it's actually called, I think that's what it's called. Anyways, no, it's not doc test. I'm thinking of cargo rustdoc. Yeah, so Rustdoc is the CLI tool. You can actually run Rustdoc by yourself right there without using cargo. But again, since I don't want to have to specify all of these input parameters directly to Rustdoc, then I am just going to use cargo doc. And this cargo doc CLI here is just kind of a helper that passes in the kind of sane default arguments for the CLI command here. And if we take a look at the target directory here, sure enough, you can see that we've got this doc folder right here. So we have the debug folder. That's where our project would typically get compiled as a debug release. And then we would also have a release directory under target if we actually built a -- release quality version of our binary. But yeah, the documentation is going to get published into that target directory along with everything else. Now, there's a whole bunch of files that get generated in here as part of the Rustdoc CLI. So we are generally going to be opening up these HTML files, and that's going to be kind of our entry point into the documentation. And so right now we don't really have a whole lot in here because all we have is just our main.rs file, and we only have one thing declared in our project, which is the main function. Now, one thing you're going to want to pay attention to when you're doing Rust documentation or comment-based documentation with Rustdoc is you're often going to need to make your members public in order for them to be visible in certain situations. And we'll kind of talk about what those are. But if you recall, looking at the Rustdoc book here, there is a feature that allows you to link to items by name. So if you're working with maybe two different child modules within a parent crate, and module number 1 over here needs to reference something in a sibling module, then in order for it to link to a function or a struct or an enum in the separate module, that module needs to declare that type or function as a public member. Otherwise, that link is not going to work properly. So as you're working with documentation, just kind of keep it in the back of your mind that public visibility is going to be necessary for certain features of Rustdoc to work. All right, so for starters here, I'm going to go ahead and declare crate level documentation. So this is kind of the root level documentation that we see at the crate level. This is your opportunity to introduce your library to your users and kind of describe what the intent of that library is and how to actually consume it. So you'll want to provide kind of a high level description, a detailed description, as well as a couple of just very basic code samples to show people how to kind of copy and paste those code samples and integrate it into their application rather. So in order to do crate level documentation, we're going to do a double / and then an exclamation point here. And this is called inner documentation because it's being defined inside of the crate. And so it's going to apply to the outer item, which is the crate itself. So even though we're defining it inside of main.rs, it's applying to the kind of parent object above main.rs, which is the crate. So we'll just go ahead and say this is some sample content for the crate level docs. And then remember, I said you can use Markdown in here. So let's say that we wanted to do a heading. So we'll say introduction or detailed introduction or something like that, right? So we can do a double hash sign here to make an H2 heading. We could use a single hashtag for a H1 heading, triple, quadruple, and I think you can go up to like an H5 with Markdown. So feel free to use whatever specificity you want for those headings. And then we could just say, you know, this is a detailed intro. And we can do some other cool stuff too. So with Markdown, we can make lists of items. We can either use a dash to create a list item, or we can use an asterisk to create a list item as well. So we'll just say item 1, or let's do something a little bit more specific. We'll do a heading here called features, and we'll say this crate allows you to create person objects. And I use person objects and animal objects and other types of objects in my applications to use as samples. We could also say this crate allows you to create grocery bills. So if you saw from my last video, we used grocery bills and grocery items as examples. So we're just kind of describing the functionality that our crate provides. Now, if you want to create kind of a checklist, so let's say that you have future planned features that haven't been implemented yet, then you can use this syntax where you put square brackets and then just put like an X inside of there to say, all right, this feature is implemented. Or we can do square brackets with no X in the middle to indicate that this is incomplete, or we haven't implemented this capability yet. So we can kind of create some future features here that we want to implement but aren't implemented yet. And we can just check off the features that are or aren't implemented. So this is crate level documentation. We could also plug in like an examples section here and then do triple dashes here and say, all right, construct a new person by doing person and then first name Trevor .toString, right? Something like that. And then we'll go ahead and generate it. So let's do let p1 equal person, and then maybe print line and then do a placeholder, and then do p1.first name. Okay, so that's a simple code example that somebody could copy. They could construct a new person object, assign it to a variable, and then grab the first name field value and pass it in and substitute it here in the print line macro. So what we'll do now is say cargo doc, and that'll go ahead and regenerate our documentation in that directory. So now what we want to do is open that path. So what we can do is say cargo doc -- open, and normally that would open your browser, but there's some kind of integration on my system that's not working. So what I'm going to do is just copy this link to the index.html file, and we'll go ahead and just paste it into our browser here. So as you can see right up here at the crate level, this is kind of the root level of our documentation for this project. Here's the description that we provided. Here's the H2 heading, detailed introduction. It also has an anchor tag there. So if you're sending a link to somebody and you want to link to a specific section in the crate level documentation, that anchor tag will allow you to accomplish that. And then right down here under features, you can see that we've got these two list items because we used a dash or an asterisk in Markdown. And we checked off one of these boxes here because we used those square brackets to indicate that we have a checklist of items. You don't have to use the checklist feature with the lists. You can just create bulleted lists without that, but I just wanted to kind of show you both of those capabilities. We can also do formatting like italics, bold, strike through text, and things of that nature by using a few different Markdown syntaxes. So let's say this is outdated, so don't use this. Okay, let's say we wanted to kind of strike this out, but we wanted to leave it in place. So what we can do is use a double or single tilde character here around the content that we want to strike out. And then if we just do cargo doc again, and then switch back to our browser and do a Control-Shift-R to refresh, you can see that we've done some strikeout text right down here. So it kind of leaves the text in place, but it shows somebody that, hey, maybe it's outdated. Maybe I should avoid going that route. You can also do bolds, like this is something really important. You know, this is a really important concept. And then we can just do a double asterisk around here. And then we could also do emojis. So on Windows, you can do Windows period on your keyboard and insert an emoji from the emoji search feature here. Let's do something like an alert and insert a couple emojis. Then we'll do cargo doc again. That runs almost instantaneously. And so now we've got some bold text here, and we've got a couple of emojis. So feel free to use any of these Markdown features and others that you might find in the Rustdoc documentation, the Rustdoc book, to kind of format and spice up your documentation and make it more engaging. You know, a lot of developers are really good at writing code, but when it comes to documentation, they might be thinking, oh, I'm an expert on this utility that I'm writing, so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail. I'm not going to do things from kind of a novice level. So it's really important that you kind of guide people through how to use your crate and all of the functionality that it provides. So use this crate level documentation as that opportunity to really provide that beginner's intro to how to use your project. And then at the very end, kind of expand and say, all right, these are some more advanced use cases. So feel free to drill into the separate module and use these more advanced features once you're ready and after you've already learned how to use the basic features. All right, so at the moment, you can see that the only thing that we have defined in our project as far as types or functions, traits, that kind of thing, all we have under this functions heading way down here is the main function. You'll see this little lock icon next to the main function, and this indicates that the main function is a private member of this crate. So what that means is that this is not visible to other crates that would try to import this crate if it was a library. Obviously, this is a binary project. So what we'll do for starters is actually create a child module, and then we'll start to declare some functions and types inside of that child module. Now, I did a video on modules quite some time ago, several weeks back, so feel free to check that one out. I'll probably do more videos on modules too, because there are multiple ways to structure your modules. But one of the simplest ways of declaring a module in Rust is to just use the mod keyword here. So what we'll do is say mod people. And this module is going to deal with anything about creating person objects, maybe adding person objects together using the operator overloads that we talked about in the last video. And so what we'll do for starters here is just define a data structure called person. And I use this commonly in my examples just because representing a person is a really common thing. If you're doing, medical records applications, if you're building a CI/CD pipeline utility that's a SaaS-based service and you want people to sign up for it, you're going to be gathering this kind of information from people generally. So we'll do last name, string as well. And I'm not going to go in too much depth with the fields here because we're mainly going to be focusing on the documentation aspect of it. Now, as you can see, we've got this message here saying people should be snake case. So we'll go ahead and fix that with a lowercase. And it's complaining that person is never constructed. So that's not really a big deal because we don't care too much about that. We're just basically focusing on the documentation now. So what we can do if we want to document this module called people here, well, actually, let's first start by not documenting it. And if we come back and just generate our docs and refresh, now you can see we've got this modules section. So that modules section was completely missing because we didn't have any child modules. But because we created a child module, now it's showing us child modules that are declared within our crate. So this module is currently private because we declared it as a module without using the pub keyword prior to it, right? So we can drill in there and we can see that there is a person struct declared in there, and it automatically generated this entire document here showing any auto-implemented traits as well as the individual fields on my data structure. Now, I don't have any documentation for either the module level or the structure or the individual struct fields that I've declared. So we need to go through and actually add that. Now, I'm going to go ahead and make this a public module, so that'll take away that little lock icon in the documentation. I'm also going to declare the person struct here as a public type as well, so that'll be a publicly accessible type from other modules in my project. So now what we're going to do is specify some documentation for the module. And I can do that with triple forward slashes here and say this module deals with people and person objects, something like that. And then for our struct down here, we'll just do a triple slash. And remember that the triple slash is documenting the object that's directly following it. So in this case, this comment precedes the module. And in this case, on line 29, the documentation here is preceding the struct. So the triple slash means document the following object. So we'll say this person struct represents a user of the system. Cool. So let's go ahead and regenerate those documents and refresh here. So now we're on the person struct type here, and you can see that we now have some documentation that goes into detail as far as what this struct does. We still don't have documentation for our fields, but we did add module level documentation. So down here under the list of submodules in our crate, you can see that we've got a nice handy dandy description field on our module. So any other modules that we declare inside of our crate, even if they are private modules, we want to make sure that people know why those modules exist in our crate, and we can do that by providing the high-level guidance right here. Also, if we drill into the module itself, you'll see that we have more in-depth documentation here. And when you're on the module list here, you're not going to see multiple lines of documentation. So if we had a really long set of documentation here that's introducing the module, kind of like what we had up in the crate here, let's do a detailed intro and say this mod has a person struct to represent users, and this module can be expanded in the future to deal with other user-related stuff. And of course, I made a couple of typos here, so let's fix those. So now if we do cargo doc again, and we switch back over to our browser, you'll see that only the first line of the documentation is being used in the module summary. But if we go into the details for that module, we'll see all of the subsequent lines after the first line. So when you're providing this brief description for your modules or any other types that you're declaring in here, you want to make sure that you are using that first line as the kind of summary of what that module or type or function is doing. And then you can always go into more depth in the future lines. All right, let's also add documentation to our main function here. So let's go into main and we'll do a triple slash and we'll say this is the entry point to our people application. Okay, so now we've got some documentation for our main function as well. And if we refresh, you can see that that summary is displayed right there inside of our crate. Awesome. So now we've got this module. We've got a person struct in here. We've got a summary for the person struct, but we can also document the individual struct fields. So let's go to our struct definition inside of our child module here. And we can use the / once again to specify documentation for the individual fields. So if you have some really weird field names, which hopefully you don't, but if you have something like fname, I might not know as a user of your crate what fname means. Now, I know its first name because I'm the one who's creating this project, but if you're coming along and reading, pub struct person fname, is that first name? Is it Frank's name? Is it, what exactly does that mean? So we'll just add in a description here that says this fname field represents the first name of the person. Now, notice what I did here. So I used the / to denote the documentation for the following field, but I also used these individual backticks to surround the name of the field. And what you'll notice is that after we regenerate our documentation and refresh the page, a monospace font is being used to render this code, just like you see in any code samples. So anytime that you are referencing a field or a function name or an argument name or something like that, that's kind of a well-known entity, you can surround that in backticks, and that causes the Markdown rendering engine to render that in a monospace font that looks like code that you'd be writing in a code project, rather than a variable spaced font that's used for general documentation and reading purposes. So that's really nice. And then we can just kind of complete things out and say, this is the last name of the person, and try to avoid comments that just say like, this is the last name field, or this is the first name field, because in general, it's really helpful to just kind of go into more depth. Like, this is the last name of the person who subscribed to my cloud SaaS service, right? That's a lot more explicit than just saying this is the last name field. Okay, great, but why do we need a last name? Well, it's because they signed up for my cloud SaaS, and I need to be able to address them in marketing emails by first and last name, right? So try to be a little bit more explicit. Try to think of things from a novice user perspective when you're writing your documentation. That's just a really good practice. And so there we go. We have documented both of those fields. Now, we can also declare modules in other ways. So one of the things that we can do, as I've done in other videos, is create new files here. So I'm going to create another file here called animals.rs. And then over in main here, we're going to go ahead and declare that. And you want to make sure that all of your crate level documentation right up here, so lines 1 through 21 here, these are all crate level documents because they're referring to the outer object with the / exclamation point. So what we're going to do is make sure that we go after that crate level documentation, and then we can do pub mod animals, and that will basically import the animals module in animals.rs into the scope of our main.rs file. So now I can do struct dog, breed, string. I could do struct cow, name, string, and so on and so forth. And I can go ahead and document these types as well. So this represents a cow in my Zelda-like game. And we'll go ahead and save that. And then do a document comment here that says this is the name of the cow. All right, so let's do cargo doc once again here and come back to our docs. And if we go down to modules, you can see we've now got a new module that's automatically been inserted here because Rust is kind of looking at our project and figuring out what modules are declared. So we'll go into the animals module, and now we have 2 private structs because we didn't declare them as public. And so for cow here, it says this represents a cow. And if we take a look at the details here, we can see the documentation for that individual field. So just remember that your modules in Rust can be declared as separate files. They can also be declared as child code blocks inside of another block inside of your main project. And there's actually other ways where you can create subfolders. I forget what the exact name of the file is, but you can create a subfolder for a module and then give the module a specific name, and that will allow you to import that module from that alternate location as well. So there's several different ways to declare modules in Rust, but those are just a couple of them, and how we can provide documentation across different module structures. Now, one other thing that we talked about is that we can specify documentation for that's external to our project here. So let's say that, for example, in the main.rs file here, I've got my main function that's the entry point, right? And so what I could potentially do is say that I want to include documentation in a separate file. You know what? Let's actually do it for the animals.rs here. So what I want to do is actually create a document for the module itself, because we haven't actually implemented it at the module level. If we go into animals right here, you can see we don't have any module level docs. So what I'm going to do is create a file here called animal-docs.md. And so this is going to be a separate markdown file. And because it has the MD file extension, my editor here, VS Code, knows that this is a markdown file. And if I have any markdown extensions installed, or you can see this breadcrumb kind of situation going on here, VS Code allows me to work more intelligently with Markdown inside of a separate Markdown file than if I'm doing Markdown inside of a Rust document. And so, or a Rust source code file, I should say. And so this is really nice because it allows me to separate my documentation, but then I can import it into my Rust code files by using the include string. So let's do include str Rust. And this is a macro that's part of the standard crate here. And all we have to do is reference a file that contains the documents that we want. And then there's a doc attribute. So if we do rustdoc attribute, you can see that we can use this in order to include a markdown file into our source code file. So if we want to declare our documentation for the animals module separately, then we can do that right up here. Remember, the first line is going to be used for the summary though. So this module contains various animals for my game. And then down here under animals, we could create maybe a subheading under animals for, the cow type. We could create documentation for the dog type and other types of animals that might appear in our game. Maybe there's chickens kind of running around the map as well in some sort of game. And so now what we can do is, start to do things like plug in code samples. So how do I construct a cow? So I'll do cow, and then name is Nancy dot to string. So we'll say let C1 equal cow, and then we'll just do print line, and then say C1 dot name. And so there's another kind of code sample that we're embedding in our project. So now what we'll do is go back to our module, and what we want to do is specify that we want to include the documentation for the parent object here. So what we're going to do is say doc here, and then include string. So we'll say doc, and then we'll say equals include str. And remember that macros are executed at compile time. So when we compile our application, the macro will basically expand to whatever it returns. So what we'll do is just say ./animal-docs.md. And because this is being applied to the outer module, we need to make sure that we do an exclamation point here, because otherwise this will reference the following entity. So if we tried to use it right here, then this would basically refer to the dog rather than referring to the module, which is the parent scope that we want to apply it to. So when we're using this, we do an exclamation point, just like when we are documenting the crate level stuff in main.rs here, we can go ahead and just use // exclamation point rather than ///, which refers to the next item. So back in animals here, we'll go ahead and save this. Let's do a cargo doc, and we'll come back to our documentation, do a refresh, and now you can see that we've got module level documentation, very similar to how we have crate level documentation at the root of our crate. We can go into the child modules. There's my little summary, which is the first line of that separate markdown file. And now I can see all of the subheadings that I've got right here inside of my Markdown. So it's really up to you if you want to embed Markdown into your source code files, or if you want to kind of extract and separate your documentation into separate Markdown files and then import those with the doc attribute and the include string macro. But this is certainly one way that you could accomplish it. All right, so we are moving right along here. One other thing I wanted to show you how to do is to embed these code samples into your project tests. So right now we have a couple of different code samples in main over here. We have an example right here that says let p1 equals person, and then we print the person's first name. And then we also have this example in animals, which is defined in the separate Markdown file that instantiates a cow, and then it just prints out the cow's name. Now, I'm not necessarily sure if these are going to work, and they probably won't because the cow is a private struct here. But what we can do is say cargo test, and this should allow us to execute any code samples that we have in our project here. So it is going to compile our application here, and then it'll attempt to run some tests. Now, I think the tests only run if you have a library, not necessarily a binary. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and define lib.rs here, and we'll define a struct cow with a name field here. And then I'm going to switch over to animal docs right here and just grab this sample right here. And then we'll go back over to lib.rs, and we'll go ahead and just paste this in. So let's do a ///, and then we'll go ahead and add our triple backticks around the code sample right here. And so now let me do cargo test, and sure enough, you can see that it did attempt to locate this test. So I think cargo test is only going to work on the doc comments that you have in library-based crates, not necessarily application or binary crates that have a main entry point. So as you can see, our test did fail here. It says cannot find struct, and that's probably because it is a private struct. Let's just try to make it public here and see if that works. And it's still saying it can't find. So let's try to specify a use statement here. So we'll say use self cow, see if that works. And let me do a capital S self here and see if that works. So I'm not having much success here. Let me try crate. Crate is another prefix that you can use. And for some reason, it's still not finding it. And that's probably because I have a library and a binary in my project here. But the point is here that you can see that it's attempting to execute these code samples inside of my project here and attempt to actually run that code and see if it works or not. And then based on the failure of these code samples that are embedded into your Markdown documentation, you can choose if you want to abort the build entirely or if you want to, do something else in your CI/CD pipelines. So you can embed those code samples. Another cool feature of the Rustdoc utility here is that we can actually enforce documentation across our project. And this is where visibility of members comes into play. So it's only going to enforce documentation for public members. I'm not sure if there's a way to override that where you can force documentation for private members as well. But if we take a look at our animals module right here, we have pub_struct dog and pub_struct cow in this child animals module. So what we could do, and let me just delete this lib.rs file here now that we've looked at the embedded examples in Markdown. And so now what we want to do is to enforce documentation for both the dog struct as well as the cow struct. So what we can do is use this special macro here called warn, or you can also use one called deny, and this will actually cause the build to fail for a certain reason, but I'll just do warn for now, and we'll say warn and then say missing docs. So by using this, we can enforce having documentation for our types in here. And you'll see that immediately the Rust Analyzer extension in VS Code is showing that we have missing documentation for a struct. So that's going to show up in our problems pane right here. And so we can literally just jump to these missing documentations. So we can do a filter on problems and say missing documentation, and then say, all right, I want to go over here and I want to document this type. So we'll do // This is the dog type that represents dogs in my game. And as soon as we fix that, you can see that that problem disappeared. So we no longer have any problems matching that particular filter because our cow is already documented here. You can also do a deny here. So if we changed the warn to deny, and we remove the documentation there, that changes the warning into an actual compiler error. So if we try to do a, cargo build here, you're going to see that we have a problem with our build because we are enforcing missing documentation. So if we bring that documentation for the dog type back and rerun cargo build, you can see that cargo is allowed to build our project. So feel free to use either warn or deny with missing docs, and that'll help you to enforce having good quality documentation for your project. All right, so I think the last feature that I wanted to go over for now is going to be the feature that allows you to link to different types between your different modules. So let's say, for example, that right over in our module that deals with people, maybe we want a person to be able to have an animal as a pet, like a dog or a cow could be a pet in a game that maybe you're building, or maybe you're building a real world application that allows you to manage ranches or something, right? And maybe a ranch owner has dogs and cows and horses and sheep and all that kind of stuff. So we want to be able to go over to this people module that declares the person struct. And then we could have maybe a field on the person struct that represents the animals that are owned by that particular person, right? And so that's going to require us to actually link over to the animals module here and actually reference a type from this module. Now, right now, these are private types, so we need to make sure that they are public. So we're going to make sure that pub struct dog and pub struct cow are there. It looks like we actually already did that. We just didn't regenerate the docs. So let's just do cargo doc to regen and refresh. And yeah, sure enough, now these are public types because they no longer have the lock icon there. And so what we want to do is basically go over to the people module, which is actually declared in main.rs because it's just a child block right here. Of course, we could kind of extract that as a separate file. So let's move the people module over into people.rs, and then we'll go ahead and say pub mod people from main. So now we've got people and animals as separate modules in separate files in our project. And so if we wanted to create a field here, like a vec of animals, so a single person can have many, many animals, right? Could be 1, could be 10, could be 50. It doesn't really matter. But we'll add in a new field here called animals, and we'll make it of type vec. And then we'll do something like an animal trait, probably. So let's maybe go over here and say pub trait animal, and then we'll be able to implement that trait for multiple types. But what we want to do is say vec of type, and then we'll do crate level animals, and then animal trait. So basically anything that's an animal will be able to be a member of this. And I think we need to do the din keyword here as well. And we also have a sizing issue here. So let me think about the best way to handle this. You know what? For now, we're just going to say that we can have a vec of dogs. And then what we'll do is let's just eliminate this here, this trait, and then we'll basically just say that we can have multiple dogs. I'm having some issue with the dynamic dispatch here that I'll probably have to figure out later on. But for now, we'll just say that we have a vec of dog as animals. And let's say that in the documentation for this specific animals field here, that we want to link over to the documentation for the dog struct. So this will say these, or this field points to all the dogs owned by this person. So now what we can say is we could change this to capital D dog. And then what we could do is reference the dog type by using these square brackets. So what you want to do is go to the documentation for Rustdoc and look at linking to items by name. And what you can do is disambiguate by going to crate and then animals and then dog. So as long as we put this fully qualified path, just like we would do in a use statement, then what we can do is actually link this documentation over to the public type, which is dog, right? Now, this won't work for private types. It will only work for public types, at least based on the testing that I did previously. So let's go ahead and refresh. We'll go over to people here, go into person, and then find the animals field, which is of type vec_dog. And then you see this link right here. This will take us directly over to the animals module. So now we're in the animals module and we're looking exactly right at the dog type here. So this is a really nice way to be able to link from one child module that deals with people and then link over to a data type in a separate module that implements a different type that might relate back to the person type that we implemented in the person module. This is a really cool feature that just allows you to kind of make embedded links inside of your project and make your documentation all that much more usable. Now, keep in mind that if we change the visibility, if we go over to the dog here and we make that a private member, then we are going to have an error here because it says the struct dog is private, right? And we are referencing that from over here. So this is actually a compiler error. So if we were to comment out that field, and then maybe let's say move this comment up to the person level documentation. So basically I'm just kind of commenting out this field to fix the compiler error. And then we are still attempting to reference the dog type. I think this is going to fail. So if we do cargo doc here, and then let's refresh the documentation for person type here. So now you can see that this link right here with the square brackets, it says create animals dog, but this is no longer a proper link. We can't click on it. And this is because the dog type is private instead of public. So even if we don't use the dog type, as long as we make it public and regenerate our docs and refresh the page, you can see that the link is now working. So hopefully they add support in the future for Rustdoc to link to private types across modules, but for now, that doesn't seem like it's possible using the deep linking feature in Rustdoc. Now, another feature that you can potentially run into is having conflicts with types. So type names, I should say. So let's say that our animals module here actually declares a public struct of dog, but we also have a pub fn called dog as well. And I'm not going to do anything inside the function body here, but you can start to see the issue here where we have a dog struct and a dog function, but in the documentation for our people type over here, we're pointing to dog, and we're not really specifying if it's a function or if it's a struct or a trait or an enum or whatever. So if we refresh the docs here, you can see that by default, it's going to point to the dog struct here. But what if we wanted to link to the function? Well, what we can do is prefix the link with fn at, and that will force it to link to the function instead of to the struct. So now when we click on this link, it's going to take us to the dog function in the animals project rather than the dog struct. We can also force it to be the struct by specifying the struct at keyword and then regen that. And now if we click on that link, it's going to go back to the struct. We could also potentially have a trait. So let's say that we had a trait dog here. I'm not sure if it's going to allow us to do that since we have a type in there. So yeah, we can have a trait, or no, it's not. So the compiler is going to complain because we can't have a struct and a trait with that name. But just to show you really quickly, if we had a public trait of animal and say, this is the animal trait that applies to all concrete animal implementations. So now what we can do is link directly to the trait by using the trait prefix as well. So what we could potentially do is say that this field points to all of the trait at create animals animal trait. And now we are referencing a trait in the documentation rather than a function or a struct. So let's do a cargo doc gen again. And if we refresh, now you can see that this link is actually pointing to the trait called animal. And we're being very explicit about that because we're using the trait at prefix here. So you can use, function at as a prefix, enum, struct, trait as a prefix, and point to specific items that are declared in that target module that we are attempting to link to. So feel free to use that technique to link between things in your project, and also check out the documentation here to find other supported keywords. You can also use the super keyword, the self keyword, and things like that as valid links within your Rust documentation. So anyways, I think that's everything that I had for this particular video. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. There's lots of great features inside of Rustdoc. There are some other features that we didn't get a chance to cover in this video as well, but I'll save that for a future video that goes in more depth into Rustdoc. Again, just please, if you enjoyed this video, make sure that you come back to my channel, youtube.com/TrevorSullivan, subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment down below, and check out the links in the pinned comment if you want to support my channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Take care.